corporations are just so brazen. They say, well, we would love to go into this, but we cannot do it without state subsidy. Well, if you cannot do it without state subsidy, what are you going to give back to the state? This question is never asked. The state subsidizes and the profits are theirs. So we kind of already have a type of socialism, but it's a one-way socialism where governments support these big corporations.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
This is Propa-Ganada.
Welcome to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly, but politely, challenge corporate power in Canada. Now, it kind of seems to me like the word socialism has been tossed around as of late. It seems like there's some mythologies and kind of lies and misconceptions still surrounding this idea of socialism. So, in today's episode, I speak with Radhika Desai, and she's one of the world's leading scholars on Marxist theory and books. And she's written many books herself, and she's a professor of political science at the University of Manitoba, and she's the director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Please enjoy. This is just a general curious question. How do you summarize the importance of your work and Marx?
There's a certain peculiarity to the way our society works. On the surface, it looks as though it works in a certain way, but that is not how it in fact is. There is an underlying reality, which is the true reality, and in our everyday experiences, in general, although sometimes we glimpse those realities, we do not see them in a systematic fashion. So the importance of Marx's work lies in uncovering the reality of our society.
A lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about socialism. So the first one is, socialism, it can't work. It just leads to, mass atrocity, genocide, Stalin, Mao in China. It's a nice idea, but it can't work.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important thing. And I whatever I'm going to say, I'm not going to, how can I say, I do not wish to deny that there were problems that led to, for example, famine in the Soviet Union. In the case of China, the so-called Great Leap Forward famine, my understanding is that it is highly exaggerated. Yes, there was a problem. And yes, there was, shall we say, a certain, failure of crops, etc., but it was managed much better than you might imagine. So having made that qualification, let me say the following. To say that there was, socialism leads to these sorts of atrocities is to completely forget one little but absolutely critical word. It's imperialism. Let me just put it this way. For the simplicity's sake, then we can discuss the ins and outs. In order to industrialize in order to become more prosperous, you have to industrialize. If we all remain farmers, we would not be as prosperous, but there would be no prosperity. Prosperity relies on a fairly significant degree of industrialization. Now, take any society, at point zero, that is before the change begins, it is an agricultural society. So the only conceivable way in which you will industrialize is by transferring resources, transferring capital, transferring labor, transferring raw materials, transferring food, etc., from the agricultural sector to feed the growing industrial sector. There is no two ways about it. You can't, it's not going to appear from Mars. So that's what you have to do. Now, what we don't realize is that you and I, or the ordinary person on the street, thinks that the West has industrialized on its own stream and it did so without any atrocities. That is simply not true. It did so on the back of imperialism. The people who paid the price of that industrialization lived elsewhere. One of the things I love, one of the things I just sticks in my mind is, you know, how our political leaders, when they are trying to finger this or that dictator, right? They're saying, "Oh, he's killing his own people." So it looks as though it's not good to kill your own people, but it's perfectly okay to kill other people's people, which is what we go around doing all the time, which we have done for centuries. Western countries have done for centuries, either directly or in association with other Western powers. To make a long story short, I think that you need to remember this little word called imperialism, and you need to open that box, because once you open that box, you will actually realize what is involved there is the rape of the rest of the planet in order to pay for the industrialization of the first world. And the Soviet Union and China simply did not have these luxuries. So in their processes of industrialization, you had these problems. Undoubtedly, there were problems. I wish they had never happened. Etc. But you cannot say that somehow the West is totally clean. And also, the other thing is, the West is not totally clean. The West's hands have more blood on them than these people. Remember, the West includes Germany, and I'm not trying to label Germany as, you know, outstandingly bad. I think that these things have happened for structural reasons, but Germany has, you know, had a lot to answer for, shall we say, and that today we sort of normalize it. Basically, capitalism is a slightly berserk society. Why? Because most societies, whether they are good or bad, but all other societies, whether they're good or bad, they have focused on directly producing the things you need. You need to produce grain, you need to produce tractors, you need to produce factories, you need to produce electricity, you need to produce shoes and shirts and slacks and whatever. People produce the things they need. We, however, focus, although the production of these things is a byproduct, the real aim of capitalism is to produce this vague thing called value and try to appropriate it, which is represented in money. So this idea that you should aim at producing this elusive thing which you cannot eat or live on, and everything else is produced as a byproduct, this is crazy. Like, why bother? Like, why eat like this when you can eat like this?
Yeah.
Do you see?
That's perfect. I love that. Yeah.
Right? So it's a totally roundabout way of doing things. So obviously, I would not want to go back to feudalism, but in feudalism, on the whole, even though there were small markets for things that people, luxury goods, on the whole, people produced the things that they consumed, and they so that was the obviously we need to produce the things we need, and then we also need to produce and distribute them equally amongst us, because of course equality is a very important point. And I in my zeal to mention the novel point, I forgot this very basic point, that it has to be an equal distribution, and we all produce everything together and we all enjoy it together. Anyway, to come back to the point of innovation, it's a very important point, and I think it is one of those deeply ideological points which tends to justify capitalism when there is absolutely no need to. And I'm going to make two refutations of this, in two different ways. Let's take one historical refutation. Historically, some of the biggest advancements in science and technology which have made our lives better, you know, whether it is radio waves or penicillin or whatever it is, you know, they have actually come from basically people who were not trying, they were discoveries from people who were not trying to make money out of it.
Right.
So that's the very key point. Whereas today we have these huge bureaucracies of big corporations and their R&D divisions with teams and reams of scientists who are like going off and doing all this research. But what is the result? Number one, the actual, shall we say, leaps in scientific progress are hardly there. There are actually no leaps. There are little incremental changes. It's a bit like, because science has become like committeeized, it's the way that a committee thinks. So a committee will only take little tiny steps forward, and sure, it may take a little tiny step forward, but the tiny steps are also, they may be forward, or are they really forward, or are they actually sideways or in the wrong direction? Because so much science is now devoted to helping corporations make more and more money.
Mm-hmm.
So, you'd rather tweak a pharmaceutical product slightly to extend its patent life, and all sorts of ingenuity is spent on that,
Mm-hmm.
rather than spent on simply sitting back and thinking the big thoughts that are really going to take us beyond
Mm-hmm.
beyond where we are. So that's the first point I wanted to make, is that the profit motive actually does not seem to be the greatest motive for innovation.
You could also make an argument that most of the basic fundamental research was actually through public funding, right? In like the National Science Foundation.
Exactly.
And the pharmaceutical.
I was going to make is
yeah.
exactly that.
Okay.
So if you take, if you think the internet is the bee's knees, well, where does it come from? It comes from DARPA. And ARPA and whatever. So similarly, and Mariana Mazzucato has done a great public service in simply writing this little book called The Entrepreneurial State, in which she simply rattles off, and it's totally readable. It's meant for the ordinary reader. She just rattles off all the different things that have actually come from state aid. And today, corporations are just so brazen. They say, well, we would love to go into this, but we cannot do it without state subsidy. Well, if you cannot do it without state subsidy, what are you going to give back to the state? This question is never asked. The state subsidizes and the profits are theirs. So we kind of already have a type of socialism, but it's a one-way socialism where governments support these big corporations. Each one of these corporations is a giant planned economy. The only problem is that it is planning not for the public good, but
Right.
for the private good of tiny, tiny, tiny elites.
Right.
Yeah, the word socialism sounds very scary, but the other, to many people, because of the propaganda against the idea of socialism, we have been made to fear socialism. But consider this: if you've ever been in the New York subway system, it's Orwellian.
Mm-hmm.
It's this underground world where the proles live and they are transported from one place to another. It's horrible, it's dirty, it's ugly, etc. The Soviet Union built its subway systems as palaces for the people. Each subway station has something unique and beautiful in it.
Oh, wow.
And they're beautifully created. You should just Google them. You just Google, Moscow subway system and go to images, and you will see such amazing, so this shows you what socialism considers, how socialism invests in public spaces and public amenities, whereas capitalism simply does not. John Kenneth Galbraith had a wonderful phrase: private affluence, public squalor. And this is
Right.
the kind of state we live in. Of course, we have very many privatized or semi-privatized public spaces. So our malls look fantastic because they're semi-privatized public spaces.
Yeah.
But even then, like I remember thinking, I find Heathrow Airport, which is, supposed to be this glittering and glamorous airport, it's one of the worst airports to be in, because every place you're in, you're being bombarded with messages: buy this, buy that, buy this, buy that. There is no sense that this place is for me. It's only for me if I have piles of money and I have a mind to buy lots of things.
Yeah.
If I'm neither of those things, or only one of those things, it will not work.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I think that public amenities are much better. And, even to this day, for example, you will find that many of the old socialists, like in the Soviet Union, East Germany, etc., reminders of those public amenities.
Mm-hmm.
Every neighborhood had a decent swimming pool, gym complex, etc., etc., and parks and places where people could simply be themselves without being assailed by commercial messages.
Right.
Because what is so vitiates our public spaces is this billboards and advertising is everywhere. You
Yeah.
can't even go to the bathroom without looking at an advertisement these days.
Yeah.
You know, everybody is selling your eyeballs to somebody else.
Yeah.
So,
And we're not even going to go down the path of how that affects mental health, right? Constantly being told that you're inadequate and that your life is inadequate and that the only way to get a little bit better is by, but let's leave that for another time. The assumption is that a socialist type of system can't be scaled up. It might be natural.
Right. Okay, I get it. I would say that the short answer to that is that we are already living in a non-capitalist system, except that the non-capitalist system at the moment is working. We no longer actually live in a properly capitalist economy in the sense that there is markets, there is competition, etc., etc. We live in a world dominated by giant monopoly corporations who are making rentier incomes. Let's go back to the analogy you had about, we live in a capitalist society, every 50 meters, you would have to pay toll on the sidewalk. That analogy is actually not that of a capitalist economy, but of a rentier economy.
Right.
A rentier economy essentially tries to take advantage of the monopoly possession of certain privileges and advantages. So we have a rentier system because essentially our big corporations, whether it is Google or the big ICT companies or whatever, they are all charging us they're apparently giving us a lot of things, but ultimately they are charging us money for the use of infrastructure, which they have laid down long ago, which they are not spending much money on maintaining, but we need to use it, so they are charging us to use it. So it's like rent. It's not, so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that, and the banking system, where essentially we now live in a system where most of capitalism is actually occurring in the financial sector, where or most of the rentier activity is actually occurring in the financial sector, where essentially banks are given licenses by capitalist states to make money for free.
Right.
That's the long and short of it. Yeah. And that is why all of us are indebted and the banks are making money out of us.
Yeah.
So I would say that the idea that socialism cannot be scaled up, no. We already live in a non-capitalist, very high-scale economy. The issue is it going to be working in the interest of a small number of private individuals, an increasingly small number, or is it to be working, should it be working in the interest of the vast majority? And I have no doubt that in going from the first to the second, we will make some mistakes. This is in the nature of revolutions, but I would rather embark on that road, make mistakes, learn from them, correct them, and proceed further than sit in this place. And, today, I would say that in the context of the pandemic, the problems of our society are becoming more and more clear. Yeah. We live in an unequal society. We treat people who are doing really essential work very badly. We are confining people into places, into health circumstances which are extremely adverse to their health. All of these things, you can just keep on multiplying these things. We don't even have a proper productive infrastructure. Like whoever heard of, when I teach my classes, the study of our part of the world is called politics of advanced industrial societies. If we are advanced and industrial, where is our vaccine producing capacity? Where is our drug producing capacity? Where is our hospital capacity? We do not have it. We do not produce enough. We are living like vampires on the blood produced by somebody else. And unfortunately, sorry for such a macabre.
But Marx spoke like that too, right? He said that in his book, right? Sorry to interrupt, but Marx made the vampire analogy too, didn't he?
Actually, he does. He does. In fact, I sometimes think that we could make a whole opera out of it. So we should talk about that maybe sometime. But so I think it's really quite. We already live in a society which is essentially already organized in these big chunks of production. The issue is to take them into democratic ownership. Yes, as I say, we will have to figure out how to run them technically and so on. We also have to figure out how to run it democratically. All of these things are issues. But listen, Jeff Bezos does not have more brain cells than you and I do. And if enough of us put our mind to it, we can figure it out. It's not rocket science.
What I was wondering is, do you have any comments on like comparing Canada's response to the response of other countries that have more of a socialist system? How countries that have a more social control over their governments have been able to manage better, and how the average person has suffered less?
Yes, I think that basically, this wisdom is actually quite ancient. It's in the Bible, it's in many other places. Markets corrode society. They corrode society because they replace human relationships, social relationships with the cash nexus. Mm-hmm. So the more neoliberal our societies have become, the less they have been able to have the social capacity, the social cohesion, the social trust to do some of these things. So in my view, and by the way, this task has been rendered a lot, the task of ranking how well different countries have done has been rendered a lot easier by a new report that just came out, I think yesterday. It was just yesterday it came out. By an Australian organization called the Lowy Institute. And they have pointed out that, so according to their rankings, their own societies like Australia and New Zealand come up way up top. Now, I think partly this is because they are in the East, they have been used to the SARS issue and so on. So they have probably developed the capacity to deal with this. And of course, they have used their island isolation, their relative isolation to profit, to good advantage. And that has been very good. But basically, if you think about it, countries like China, Vietnam, Cuba, even Venezuela, poor little Venezuela, under sanctions, etc., they have done way better than we have. Even Germany and Japan, which are at the end of the day capitalist countries, have done better because they have a form of capitalism which has not totally neglected the social cohesion aspect. Taiwan, of course, is another. South Korea, they have done much better. And so it's because basically we have a form of capitalism which we call neoliberalism, where for the last 40 years we have been eroding our social capacities, our government capacities. By making societies more and more unequal, we have become less and less trustful of each other. So, trust basically is not there. And you often see that for Canadians who go to the United States, you will see that, in everyday transactions, there is considerably less trust in the US than there is here, because we retain some of those social cohesive capacities. So, broadly speaking, I would say that countries that retain some sense of themselves and who they are beyond capitalism, above and beyond capitalism, above and beyond the market, have done better. Mm-hmm. Those who have completely surrendered to markets, or more completely surrendered to markets, I wouldn't say we have completely surrendered, but we have more completely surrendered to markets, they have done less well. Mm-hmm. The shining example is the United States. Out of a group of some 98 countries, the United States is ranked at 94 in this index produced by the Lowy Institute. Canada is somewhere in the 60s range, not good. And I think in Canada, we have a couple of problems, I would say. There is, of course, the perennial problem of federal provincial, I have a wonderful joke that I will share with you before going into this, because this really explains Canada very well. So there is this usual joke, there's an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a Canadian, and they're all asked to write essays on elephants. So predictably, the Englishman writes an essay entitled How to Shoot an Elephant. And equally predictably, the Frenchman writes an essay entitled How Elephants Make Love. The Canadian, however, writes an essay with the title Elephants, a federal or provincial responsibility, question mark. So basically, we have this sort of gray zone about, quite frankly, the federal government has a lot of power if I think it would use it, but nevertheless, it often tends to be reticent, partly because often politicians don't want to take responsibility that they don't feel they can acquit very well. And I'm sure this is the case with the Trudeau government. So that's one issue. But the other issue is that unlike the UK, which we often relate ourselves to because they have a national health system and we have a public system. But the United Kingdom, although their system has been depleted by over the, because they have also been, they went from, a very big increase in the social role in society with a completely publicly owned national health system. So they went to the great peak of sort of semi-socialism to a huge and steep decline into neoliberalism. So they are suffering from it, but still the ideal of the NHS is very deeply rooted, not just in the public, but in the doctors as well, because although the doctors were drag kicking and screaming into the National Health Service back in the 1940s, there is now generation upon generation of doctors that have grown up who are totally committed to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they have that resource, and that's very good. In our society, unfortunately, we have a publicly funded but broadly privately owned medical system. So that has also, and we have gone down the corporate route in a number of ways as well. So we have, for the intersection of those two reasons, we have done less well than we should. And we have also this strange, although this is changing now under the impact of this very severe second wave that we are suffering, we are putting travel restrictions and quarantine restrictions and all that, which is good. The problem is that we do not have the real instrument that we need because of 40 years of neoliberalism undermining our social, political, and state and health capacities. That it will be the scalpel that we need in order, the surgical scalpel we need to deal with this. We need a system of find, test, trace, isolate, and support, which if we had that in place, of course, we would need an initial period of lockdown, but while we were in a lockdown, we needed to prepare this system so that when we emerged from the lockdown, we could immediately glom onto the isolated imported cases that we got once we stopped community transmission, dealt with them so that life could go on as before in more normal ways. But we don't have that. Why? Because for 40 years, we have been going in the direction of corporate medicine. Our solution to practically every problem is give some of the other corporations lots of money to allegedly solve it for us. They never do, but they take the money and we are the poorer for it, and we do not have the goods that they deliver to us in return for this money are shoddy. They do not actually, they're not fit for purpose. So our test and trace system in Manitoba, for example, is contracted out to some crazy private company. It should not be. It should be done by the health professionals and the additional staff that they hire and they train. We're not there because we don't want to go there. We have not been talking about this. So we do not have the scalpel. So all we are reduced to is periodically using the hammer of lockdowns. So you use the hammer of lockdowns, we all suffer, we scream, then there is a brief period of freedom, but of course we do not have the infrastructure to deal with that freedom, so we are pushed back into lockdown.
Thank you so much, Radhika, and we'll talk at a later date.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Look forward to that, Jacob.